Alright guys, so today I'm going to be showing you how to do rear shocks and struts on my wife's 2009 Subaru Outback. I happen to just be doing the shocks today, so I'll be removing the springs. I have two different ways of doing that. I'll hopefully soon have a third. So in order to get started, we have to take apart the inside of the car to get access to the top of those struts. Without further ado, let's get to it. Now on either side of the car, on the left and on the right side, there's going to be the top of the strut mounts. Those are two bolts. They're both 14 millimeters. If you don't want to remove the side panel, get an open end wrench and you can just stick it right underneath and break them free. Once you've removed all four of those, we're going to lift the car up and the top of the strut mounts will be free and you won't have to go into the car again. Then it's all done on the bottom. Now, as you may or may not be able to tell, from this point on, it's pretty straightforward. There's one single bolt that holds the bottom of these struts on. We're gonna pull that off, use a jack to lower the coil so it doesn't just shoot out, and then we're gonna pull it out of the car and replace the shock. Now, with both sides out, I'm going to show you how to compress the spring, remove the shock, replace the shock, and then put it all back together. It's actually quite simple. Hopefully. So like we said, the next step is going to be compressing the spring. So I'm going to review a couple do's and don'ts on how to do that to minimize the risk to yourself. This is about how it should look when you set it all up. Now, do start this bolt by hand. Don't start it with a gun or a socket or an impact ratchet of any kind. Just start it by hand, get it tight. You don't want to run the risk of it slipping off. Bear in mind, these springs are under a lot of pressure. They do in fact support the weight of an entire car with people and whatever other kind of load that car needs to carry. Definitely be safe, be very attentive to what you're doing here. It's very dangerous if done improperly. Make sure that the arms of this are as centered on that spring as you can possibly get it. What can happen if it's not centered is that once it starts compressing, it's squishing that spring, and you have a spring that's squished on one side and bulging on the other, that's about ready to blow out. You definitely don't want to be anywhere near that. If it does decide to let go, it could ricochet off of things, hit you. Again, a lot of pressure, just be careful. Also, do not put your face over the strut while it's under tension. If anything happens, it's gonna shoot right up in your face. Don't do it, it's not wise. Do make sure you have PB or aero coil handy. It's gonna help remove those top strut mount bolts. Do not use heat anywhere on these struts because that's very dangerous. Finally, let's get to it. So I'm gonna show you how this gets set up. I like to always have the business end towards the top of the strut, but as you can see, on the side where these hooks are, there are these little sliding pins. These pins will lock the hook onto the coil of the spring so that it has no way to escape. You also want to make sure to stagger these arms equally. As you can see, the shape of a spring doesn't allow you to have equal footing on the front and back, top and bottom, however you want to classify this. So you need to make sure that the same two arms are forward and the same two arms are backwards. If that doesn't make sense, I'll show you what I mean. So what you want to try to do, slide these pins outward, place them on at the highest coil and the lowest coil you can get on the spring, seat them in place, and lock that foot by pushing in the pin. Now you're going to want to do the same over here. Slide that foot on, lock it in place with a pin, slide that foot on, and make sure it's locked in place with its pin as well. Now you may be asking why I left this top coil exposed instead of hooking the top coil, because I said grab the highest and the lowest coil possible. That is because the bottom foot on the opposing side is higher than this bottom foot is. So these two have to be offset down from the other side to make sure you have an even pressure. If your feet on one side are too far out, therefore your feet on the other side being too far in, you'll get an uneven compression of the spring and it'll start to warp funny and bend weird. And you don't want to put any excess pressure on the spring where it doesn't need to be, because that'll put you and your components at risk. All right, so now that you have that set, make sure it's centered. And that looks good to me. And then tighten this up. Once you have this hand tight and you start to see some compression in the spring, feel free to just verify that you are in fact centered on both the top and the bottom sides of the coil and that your feet are all locked. This compressor is very old, so these pins don't really stay very well. And that looks good to me. Now I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on the coil by tightening this bolt so that I can then grab the impact and loosen this nut. Doesn't take very much, just enough to keep it solid. Nearly every strut you replace will have a vinyl lock nut on top. What I like to do with the impact gun is loosen this nut enough so that the bottom few threads are still engaged with the nut, and then tighten this down all the way, and then usually once you're past the locking mechanism, whether it be vinyl or pinch nut, you can undo this by hand and then remove the old shock. If that nut does continue to spin and therefore the shock is also spinning, if you know you're going to replace the shock, grab yourself a pair of vice grips and grip the actual shock tube. Don't pull it all the way off until you're certain that your shock is loose, then go ahead and finish it off. Just like that. Now with your new shock handy, pull the old shock out, pop your old bellows off, and then switch to the new shock. Remember, always use the occluded hardware as it has the new locking mechanism. Pop that on. It's going to be a lot easier if this stayed in the spring, but in this case it didn't, so we're going to try to feed it through. There you go. Start the top nut by hand. Now at this point, if you impact that nut on, it's just gonna spin the shock. So what I like to do is spin it down until it bottoms out in the locking mechanism, and then loosen up on the compressor. What this is gonna do is put pressure on the shock to make sure that it doesn't spin inside the shock body. Now again, it's still may, and there is of course always an option on how to remedy that. Now in this case, it worked just fine. But if it doesn't work for you, I want to show you how to fix it. Most shocks have the ability to accept an Allen key in the top of the shock. There are a number of different ways to access that with what's known as offset or even pass-through wrenches, depending on the manufacturer. But basically all it is in this case a 17mm wrench, which has a bend in the neck, so it'll fit down inside the top of the strut mount and around that nut. Put the wrench in place, put the socket in place, and tighten away. And there you go. Now, let's put it on. Now for the actual installation, you may want to bring a nice array of pry bars, a nice little hammer, and some 19mm tools to tighten the bottom bolt. So, the way I've chosen to set this up, which I think works pretty efficiently, is to put the strut compressor on the spring and compress the spring as much as possible while still being safe, of course, so that there's as little pressure pushing down on that shock as you can get. The reason for that is because the next step is to jack up in the bottom of the shock. Now at rest, without the pressure of the spring on it, this hub assembly is in the upward position. So you need to elevate the bottom of the shock to meet the bolt hole for the hub. Now I have to use a medium-sized pry bar to push the shock in the forward position to make sure it lines up with the bolt hole laterally. Another way you can aid this process is with a large pry bar to push down on that upper control arm against the frame to bring the whole knuckle downward. If you have both of these things, it should be fairly easy to line up that bolt. And once you have it started, tap it in the rest of the way, and you should be good to put the nut on. Alright guys, so that's it. The last thing I like to do, which may not be necessary, is just retorque those bolts that hold the strut mounts to the car with all the weight of the car on the struts. Again, shouldn't make a difference, but doesn't hurt just to check before we put the interior back together. So I hope this was helpful to some of you. If it was, give it a like, maybe help someone else out. So I'll see you guys next time in the next video. Don't know what it's gonna be, but I hope you'll stick around to find out. Anyway, for now, that's all I've got. So see you next time.
I just found the finale. You weren't watching. If you could hear it, you would know.
You want to see it?
No.